Hello, Pulpit To Pew listeners. This is Johnny Gwynn. This is actually an episode that ran in 2016, and due to some things we had no control over this week, that we decided to rebroadcast this. We hope you enjoy this vintage show of Pulpit To Pew.
Welcome to Pulpit To Pew, a podcast that features a conversation between priest and parishioner to understand how the message translates and to further explore the weekly lessons within the Episcopal tradition and daily life. The Very Reverend Beverly Gibson, Dean of Christ Church Cathedral, and Johnny Gwynn, a newcomer to the Episcopal family, discuss what Beverly intended and Johnny heard, or got wrong.
Welcome to Pulpit To Pew. I am Johnny Gwynn.
And I'm Beverly Gibson.
So today we had church and you had your sermon, and the key takeaways for me, the main themes were faithfulness and obedience is really what I got from that.
Obedience, not a very popular word, but there it is.
Yeah, and I was saying before we started recording that this is not one of the good marketing messages of Christianity that makes you feel good about, like, oh, you know, the good news where, like, I feel really, like, good about myself for being a great person.
Well, and it's also one of those things where if you just read the lessons for today, you think, Christopher Powell, our principal musician, did his notes first this week, and I thought, well, I'll go look at Christopher's notes and see what he says. And at the very beginning, he says, these are really hard lessons, and I'm sure that Dean Gibson will illuminate these for us on Sunday. In other words, I'm not touching these. I'm just telling you what the music is.
I'll let her deal with all these difficult. He said it's a difficult readings and not easy answers. So I'll let Reverend Gibson deal with those things. But so, it is. It's the Book of Lamentations. Is that right? It's it's a poem.
It's gorgeous, and it's one of the great works out of the Hebrew tradition. And it actually, we call it Lamentations. Sometimes you hear it referred to as the Lamentations of Jeremiah. Yeah. But they're not really sure Jeremiah wrote it. It's sung. Sometimes you hear sung versions of this, especially during Holy Week. The first word is how, right? The first sentence is, how lonely is the city once so full of people. And the name of the book in Hebrew, which I don't have written in front of me, so I'll probably mess it up. I shouldn't even say it, but it's like El-Ka, which means how. And that's the name of it, how. And it's really like 5 poems that are all put together, and they're beautiful. They personify Jerusalem. Jerusalem is like a widow who's left alone and desolate and shamed because everything has been taken from her. And it's the Babylonians who have conquered and have taken a bulk of the population back into exile in Babylon. And so you've got, the temple's been destroyed, and you have this deserted city. And it's the lament over Jerusalem. Of course, Jesus will lament over Jerusalem before his crucifixion. And the temple will once again be destroyed in 70 AD. In the Christian era, yeah. So it's something that gets repeated. There's a reminder in there about Egypt, where there's also been an exile, and God delivered them from that. So it's a reminder of some of the cycles of history and of life, and in spite of itself, an encouragement to have faith, to endure where you are, to keep the faith and be who God called you to be, with certainty that maybe not you, but your children, and that's really what counts, that another generation will be delivered, and that as a people you will not be forgotten.
So is it inferred that the destruction of Jerusalem, was it by the hand of God? Was he punishing for a nation that was, because we've been talking about this destruction of Jerusalem every week. We've been bringing it up, and what is that representing for us, this destruction of Jerusalem?
It's linked with faithlessness. Okay. And if it doesn't exactly say if you'd been better, God wouldn't have done this, but it does say that you were not as faithful as you should have been. You did not attend to things as you should have. So destruction has come upon you. And that may be so broad and so understandable to us as to mean, you know, if you'd really had your stuff together, you probably wouldn't have been so dispersed or so inattentive that you couldn't pay attention and respond to this.
It's like not going and getting an oil change in your car for like 80,000 miles. You need to do that to keep up with those things, and you won't have the problems.
And then when your car doesn't work, you don't know why.
So you bring ruination upon yourself because you weren't doing the right things along the way.
Yeah, I mean, that works.
Yeah, it's a beautiful passage. I love the analogy of the woman who's been shamed and her many lovers have abandoned her. It really is it's just not something you would imagine when you think of biblical verses.
Right. It's evocative. It's beautiful to listen to when the reader gets into it. And it ties in directly with the psalm appointed for today, which is 137, which is a psalm of exile. And it's one of the really beautiful, beautiful psalms that's been set musically many times. By the waters of Babylon we sat down, we wept when we remembered Zion.
We're looking at this when things are bad. So roughly it's this idea of like, man, we are in a pickle here. Look at this once great city because we did not do things along the way. We have pretty much put ourselves in this situation where things do not look very good for us.
Well, we've been deprived of our city, carried off into exile somewhere else.
Yeah.
We're in a strange land. We hate these people because they've killed our people and taken us away. And yet here we are, and they say to us, sing us a song of your homeland. It's like, I don't feel like singing to you. And so it is sad. There's the destruction part of it. There's the exile part of it. There's really little glimmers of hope, not even really strong admonitions to faith.
It's sad.
Some reminder of it. So you've got that kind of sadness, and then today you transition into Paul's second letter to Timothy, and I didn't even go there because if you did, it'd be sounding really tough.
He's imprisoned.
He's in prison and he's about to die. I mean, this is like his deathbed letter where he says, "Oh, you're like my son, and I hear him. I'm going to give you this last little bit of advice and tell you what you need to remember," which is what he's telling him. So that's kind of got its edge to it. And then the gospel lesson is a fragment of a series of gathered up stories. So it doesn't exactly have a great context. So this is not one of your top 10. I can dance to that Sundays at the church.
It's the one that again we say it. If you're doing the marketing pitch as Jesus, this is the ones of like, trust me, it is a good thing, even though it sounds kind of bad. It was the blues.
Well, it is the blues. You're right.
Because there's joy in all that grief, and there is uplifting spiritual things in those songs. There's almost something funny with we have to have the lows before we can understand the highs.
Well, and that's one of those mythic truths, a kind of cyclic truth. But to think of it as the blues, that really does work because there's a beauty in that. There's an emotion in that. There's a value of human life in that. Kind of like the absence and the sorrow and the lack is the thing that evokes the real value. And that's what these passages do. And unfortunately, it's not easy as the preacher to sing the blues.
Right. And a lot of people don't understand, we're music fans. We have to still explain people about there's joy in those sad songs. And people, what are you talking?
Like,
what? There's a context, there's context to it, and there's understanding of the tradition of it. And when I was, the Book of Lamentations, I kept saying that's the blues. That is someone literally singing about how woe is me and where we are.
And that's why, as I said, that particular book does get set to music. I mean, Palestrina did it way back in the day, and some others have done it. And actually, I think the Psalm 137 is is set in maybe Godspell.
Okay.
It comes up in some contemporary settings and is not a particularly likely candidate, but I think it's because of just exactly what you're identifying, that it evokes that sensibility. So that's probably a good way to come at it. That's not exactly what I did, but, next time maybe.
Going back through the notes, and I do, I kept saying we keep seeing these themes of Jerusalem was in this time of disruption. It was, and then so the first reading, the second reading, Paul's in prison. He's on his deathbed. He's talking to his disciple Timothy. He's giving encouragement too, though. It's like, woe is me, and I'm in prison, but I still have faith in the Lord, and you do too. And when times are bad, that's when your faith needs to be the strongest. Right.
And here's what you have to remember to do.
Yeah.
And these are the really important things. And I see the important things now because I'm at the end of my life and I'm down to what really, really matters.
Right.
And now I'm going to tell you what really, really matters.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about hanging on to the faith that you were given. in his case given to him by his grandmother Lois and his mother Eunice. And Paul says, and I laid my hands on you and gave you God's power in that way. And those are the things that you have to hold on to and derive your strength from those things.
Yes. I like what he said, God did not make us cowards.
Right. He did not give us a spirit of cowardice.
Yeah, because they all end up pretty bad. Those martyrs had some pretty tough endings, and they were not cowards.
No, and the point is, you've got to face that bravely. You've got to face it with the courage of your convictions.
Yes.
You've got to face it and say, this is not the end.
Right.
And that's really important. But it's also important, Paul is saying to Timothy, for your ministry to bear fruit, for you to view it that way. I mean, you've got to keep your mojo up.
Right.
That's kind of the exhortation part.
It feels like business. This mentor writing a letter to an up-and-coming business person he has taken interest in, and he writes, one of those deathbed letters of, I appreciate the time we've put together. You've meant so much to me. I've learned from you as much as you've learned from me. Here's some final parting words for you to keep, because I will not be around anymore, but you need to remember these things.
Right. And that has an incredible power to it.
Oh, yes.
I mean, we speak of words from the deathbed, but we remember those. I mean, I had that experience not long ago, and the person said some things I won't ever forget, and some very personal and direct things, not necessarily about me, but about some others. And it was like, don't ever trust so-and-so. It's like, oh boy, I'm not forgetting that. I mean, if it was important enough for you to say this on your deathbed that I don't need to trust so-and-so, then I will pay attention.
That's pretty specific. That's not like a sees every day message. That is like, no, it's pretty specific on my deathbed. Don't do this.
Don't do that. And also powerful would be the admonition that you have to do this thing.
Yeah.
Because then you're a little scared.
Of course.
If you don't do it. It's like, well, if I don't do it, well, then what?
Yeah.
It's going to haunt me?
And we've talked about, we bring
in some sense, he would haunt me. I mean, even though maybe not like a ghost.
Right, but I did the one thing he told me not to do from his death, but I made a promise to them, and I'm doing it, so I am going against my contract with them. I'm not living up to my word with that person.
And now I can't let that go. I can't put that down.
Right, and that is a haunting. Right, not the white sheet ghost thingy, Halloweeny thing, but it is you're haunted by this memory because you promised somebody at a very pivotal moment in their life, and that is a bond that is. I would have a hard time ethically, knowing did I lie to that person? The last words of that I spoke to that person was a lie. I'm haunted by this.
So that's a powerful thing,
yeah.
And that's what the only way Paul has to convey that is by letter, and so that's what he's doing.
I used to glaze over the second reading, the epistle. It was, but I find it as I'm getting older. You really look into the lives of these historic figures because they share so much in those letters.
They do. And
it's so human.
It's very human, and oftentimes it's quite personal. It's like today. I mean, that sounds like somebody. Remember your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice.
You're right.
And it's like, I've heard that before. And you have the sense then that they're real human beings. And they were really doing the kinds of things we do. And they had relationships that were similar to the relationships we have. Timothy was involved in a work in which he needed encouragement in the same way that I need encouragement. And to know that I've had a mentor who's going to offer me some real direction is also a consolation. So that seems very immediate. And it does have that immediacy because it is written from one person to another and not like some of the other books, which can seem so distant. And
we haven't gotten to the ones where they're really into the letter of the law of the church. Those tend to get a little dry, but they're interesting. Yeah. I mean, to see he is laying down rules of the law of the church and what has stayed and what has not stayed is interesting.
Yeah, we can not today.
So then we go into the final reading, which again is a mentorship as well, because we have the apostles, and I kept saying reminds me of a business meeting where the CEO Jesus is there with his managers, the apostles, and the context that you wrote in your the email before the service this week was, okay, here's the reading, but let me give you the background of what of what they're saying because it makes more sense. And roughly, he's with the apostles, and Jesus is telling his managers, his apostles, we have new people that are believers in the church, and it's very fragile right now. We need to give them room and space, and do not, and this is what I'm asking you a question about, he says, we as believers need to support them and not challenge them. What would be a challenge the apostles would do to a new beginning believer?
Well, Jesus says, don't cause them to stumble.
Don't cause them to stumble.
Don't be a stumbling block to them, which is, in many ways, the same thing that you're saying. Remember a couple of things. First of all, the disciples have not been on board for that long.
Okay.
They've seen more
so it's a new company.
Yeah, they've seen more than anybody else has seen, and they're with the boss all the time. And so they know more about the way than anybody else, but they continue to be, if you think about the bulk of the Gospels, they're sort of the straight man all the time. I mean, they're always getting something wrong. Because
they're the foil.
Yeah, there's just a lot that they don't know.
Plato had Phaedrus. Phaedrus was the foil. And Phaedrus, ask me a question. You're always so smart. And he sets him up, that trap he lays for him.
He does. Well, and then he just hangs around and says, that is so Socrates.
But again, mentorship. So that I like the point of when you're reading these Bible stories, sometimes look at the words. The apostles are set up for a certain way to show a fault, possibly.
Well, they are. And Peter always says, I would never do that, Lord. And then,
and of course he does.
Then he goes and does it. And so, you know that's going to happen. But today, he's saying, these little ones, do not cause them to stumble. And he's setting it up as something dire, because he says, if you do that, if you cause one of them to fall, to lose the faith, it would be better if you had a millstone tied around your neck and you were thrown out into the sea.
Then that's pretty specific. That's bad.
Good. Okay, this is bad.
Yeah.
What I think he's talking about, in a way, is he's almost saying, don't be yourself, please, around these people. Because they're fragile, and they're new, and they're idealistic, and if they see you acting like a bobo...
Right. You have to live to a higher standard.
Right. Then you've got to rise to the occasion, because they're going to look at you and say, well, if this is the faith, and that's really true. I mean, if you think about people of some stature in the church who fall and fall hard, it really does lead people to say, well, I knew that nobody in the church is that good, and these people are always corrupt. And,
and it gives a lot of ammunition to your enemies.
It really does. Yeah. And it also sometimes causes the faithful to become disillusioned and hurt. And a lot of people leave...
Because people put trust in you, and then you let them down so badly.
Right. And people leave the church. I hear that all the time. I was faithful, I was part of the church, and then so-and-so did such and such, and I just haven't been able to go back.
And that's such a... People don't... Again, your actions have consequences, and it's not just your little world. The ripple effect across that, when people hold you up as being a pillar or something to be an example of, and when you fall... It does. It breaks the hearts of people who put so much faith in you. Right.
And people are forgiving. I mean, there's latitude, and they're forgiving, and they understand, by and large, that you're human.
And we all love comebacks, too. It's the way that person... My thing is, what does that person do after the fall is so important, not just the fall.
That is true. Yeah. That is very true.
Because if you get defensive and go the opposite way, it's like, he really is a bad person. My gosh, he has handled this so poorly. Yeah.
And that really is significant enough that it makes it into the baptismal covenant, where it says, when, not if, but it says when you fail, right? When you fall into sin, you will promise that you will repent and come back to the Lord, and you say, I will, with God's help. So there's absolute certainty that you will fail and you will fall. And to get a little more current and slightly more pop culture-ish with that, somebody like Brene Brown, and has done a lovely job with that in a very practical kind of way, that if you really try, if you put yourself out there, if you dare greatly, that's one of her books, then you're going to fall. We're all going to fall at some point. So the question is, how do you get yourself back up? How do you get up and learn something from what happened to you and move forward? Scotty
Russell, a friend of mine, is a motivational speaker. He's a graphic designer. He has a whole motivational thing for graphic designers, and it's called falling forward. Okay. And it's because in the world of, the graphic design, we create thousands and thousands of things, but only very few things actually get bought. So the idea is failure is just a part of the process.
Right. And
it's how do you deal with it?
Or falling up. You've heard that one too. And that's, writers will tell you that you write and write and write and write, and then most of it you cut. If you think it's really good, it's probably not. And you just have to keep at it and keep at it and keep at it. And any kind of practice is the same way. But in living the life of faith is that way, that you've got to know that you're not perfect and you're not always going to make it. But Jesus is reminding them how important that is for them as leaders. Because back to your manager analogy, people are really looking at them, and he's reminding them of that. And he also then, after that point, hits on the forgiveness issue. Well, Lord, how many times do we have to forgive? Is 7 times enough? And they say, no, 70 times 7.
Yeah.
You just have to forgive and forgive and forgive and forgive. It's like, what? Yeah. And that's when they turn around and say, we need more faith.
And that's where today's reading starts with the apostles look to Jesus and say, increase our faith.
Exclamation point.
Exclamation point. Like they're demanding it of the manager, of the boss, to say, you've given us this challenge, and it's bigger than we think it is, and you got to make sure you help us. And I was saying before, sometimes you'd think Jesus would pat him on the back, like, man, I've got such a great group of people. They want more faith. And instead he goes, nah, you've got plenty of faith.
Right.
It's what are you doing with the faith is what's important, not how much you have.
Right. It's not, and this is one of the mustard seed passages, where he says, if you had faith the size, and you've got that in your doodle, this little bitty mustard seed. If you had faith the size of a mustard seed, you could tell this mulberry tree to be uprooted and be planted into the sea. That it's not the size of your faith. I think what I said in the sermon was, it's not the size of your faith. It's the greatness of the God you believe in. And the awareness that what you're asking for is God's action and not your own.
Right. You are just doing the work of God. You are a worker. You are an obedient worker of much larger things.
Right. And that's where he goes directly.
Right.
And he goes then into that slave analogy.
Right. Which I said is bad marketing for Christianity.
Once again, it's a hard sell.
When he says you do the right things because you're expected to do the right things because we are believers. You are setting the example. But he says, don't pat yourself on the back because we are all worthless slaves. We have done only what we ought to have done. Like we are just slaves to a much higher calling.
Well, and then the story he tells is like, okay, you tell me, if you're a master and you've got a slave and you've been out working all day and you come into the house and you're ready for supper, are you going to put the slave down at the table first and serve him?
Right.
No. You're going to sit down at the table and he's going to serve you, and then he'll have his supper, which is not a happy translation.
Well, it's so funny. It's like, if we're Christians, do we have slaves? We're not going to get into that one because it's exegesics, right?
But this is a huge cultural difference.
It is. It's 2,000, 3,000 years ago. The language is different. The culture was different. It is. But again, this is one of those passages that people who are against the faith can easily pull up all the time, going, "Look what they condone." I'm jumping off a little bit, but it is. But it's one again. It's one of those gospels that you're reading, going, "This is a really cryptic reading this week," and we've got to dive into it and look at it. What does it mean today?
Right, you're right about that. Yeah. It falls into that category, though, and we've been talking about this for a couple of weeks, of the parables, where it's an analogy, right? And God has got to be the master, and then we're the slave. God is God, and that's what he's saying. God is the one with the power. You are not the one with the power. Don't act like God. Don't think you're God, but know that God expects some things from you. In the same way, if you make an analogy, say, with an employee. As an employer, as a boss, you expect some things from people.
That's right. It's a written and unwritten contract of the way we operate with each other.
Right. You want to take care of them.
Yep.
You have their interest at heart. You want them to do well. But the bottom line is there are things that you expect. And if those things are not done, then they have failed. And
what's great is Jesus, again, being a manager myself and being very poor at it for a very long time, the employees need to know exactly what I expect from you, and not I assume they know what they want from me. And that's what he does. And those analogies are, it's an easy lesson. Like you said, it's a cut and dry master slave. It's because no one was reading then. He was teaching in very open and understandable ways and kept it simple.
Right, that made sense
for
in their
big
world.
ideas.
Made sense in their world. And in our world, it would make sense to say, I've got to tell you as my employee exactly what I expect you to do, and those are the things that you need to do. Mm-hmm. And if you're not doing them, then you're not doing what I asked. But if you are doing them, then you're also simply doing what I asked. You don't get a bonus for doing exactly what I asked you to do.
What is that? I'm not going to congratulate you for doing your job. But what is that thing like? What do you mean to congratulate you for you actually just doing your job?
Yeah, well, here's mine. I said I had a story for you. Okay, here's my story. And this is from long ago. I have a dear friend, a very old friend, who is a city manager. And she told a story about many years ago doing some employee reviews. And she was doing reviews with people who worked at one of the city pools. And so she sits down with this guy and she says, tell me some of the things that you have done in your job as the manager at this facility. And the first thing the guy said was, he said, well, no one has drowned.
Let's start with that.
And she said, wait, I'm talking about accomplishments. That's the most baseline expectation.
Yes. That would be in the world of the bureaucracy is like, hey, no one has died on my watch.
I've had no drownings, and therefore I'm successful. But that's really what we're getting at. Well, and that's what Jesus says. If you do all the things that I ask you, you've only done the things I asked. Don't say that makes you incredible. I expect that of you. I expect it. And that's where we get into the obedience thing, and we don't do well with that.
No.
I mean, contemporary Americans don't like the obedience thing at all.
That's why I drew the little knights here, because, this lesson...
A duty and obligation.
A duty and obligation. It really does fall into servant leadership.
You're like a vassal.
And the public, that's that thing of like to politicians. Do you want me to cheer for you for just doing your freaking job? I mean, that. I expect you to do this as a citizen, but you want me to congratulate you for doing the bare minimum. That is a good way to look at that. And I love the way you put it to the apostles, saying that Jesus was telling them, you are shining examples of what can be. Mm-hmm. That's why it's important. That's why I'm saying think about servant leaders or like the military or policemen. Mm-hmm. Anyone that sits on a high level, they do have... You are an example, and you have to say, dude, you don't do the bare minimum. You go over and above. The Ritz-Carlton way. It's what do I expect from you? What did I request from you? And why don't you surprise me?
Surprise and delight.
And it is, and it's all those really do match together really well. Mm-hmm. And they aren't. If we say we are believers, then we need to be shining examples of what can be, and that is hard work, and it's hard to be obedient to that because we fall.
It is, and the question, the question is also, who am I obedient to? Well, you're being obedient to God,
right?
And it's sometimes difficult because in the contemporary sense of things, that may not always be immediately clear. For me, for instance, if my husband really wants to get at me, then he'll say, I'll do something, and he'll say, well, that's not good enough. You can't do that because you're a priest and people expect more.
And that just fumes you. That just lights the fuse.
But the other side of that, and the place where it can become a little pinprick in your head, is that you agree, if you're me, to be obedient to your bishop.
Right. We're all obedient to somebody,
and that's a matter. It's his teaching and some things that he's going to say, and there may be some places where I may not agree, or I may not like what his choice is, but that's his choice, and that is what I have to abide by and live by. And that's where my teaching needs to be.
And that's your social contract. That's what I have agreed to this. And it's like the military. It's like the drawing. You cannot tell your ranking officer, even though he is dead wrong, there is a hierarchy in place. And I agreed to this structure. Mm-hmm. Now, I would imagine, though, if there's something grievous with being unjustified, when it's not ethical or that's when you have to stray away and say, I have to break this contract because this is biblically or ethically something that's I'm so against.
If it reaches that level, then there's an avenue of recourse within the church itself for that.
Right.
So that's built into the system. for instance, and I don't mean to go off down this trail, but I agree to be obedient to the doctrine, discipline, and worship of the Episcopal Church. If that changes, does that change my vow? And that's a question. And priests have met that place. I mean, they have come to that place where, well, the doctrine, discipline, and worship of the church changed, and I cannot in good conscience follow that.
And so you
and
leave,
therefore
or...
I renounce my orders, or I leave and I go somewhere else, which, of course, you're free to do.
That's amending the contract.
Right, but you're not free to stay within and not abide by it.
Right.
So that's, and we don't have to go there.
But that goes back to the things we talked about last week and this week, the baptismal covenant. Mm-hmm. So not as a priest, but as a believer, we sit in the church and we make that contract with the baptismal covenants.
Right.
And we do it with the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed every week. Mm-hmm. And that is what we are agreeing to every week. And we need to remind ourselves, this is what we are adhering to.
Mm-hmm. Well, when you come to something like, and this is one of the promises, I will respect the dignity of every human being. Mm-hmm. Do we all really do that?
And that's an open-ended, that's kind of open. That doesn't say specifically how to treat somebody. It's open-ended. It's
open-ended.
Yeah.
Am I respecting the dignity of every human being? Are there some things that I'm doing in my life that I may not even be quite aware of that violate that?
And you talk about awareness a lot. It's not just adherence to these rules. It's awareness of what the rule is and how you're actually living in the life we live, you know?
Right. And it also demands that you do some self-examination.
Yes, the daily, weekly, monthly, and then the big, it repeats itself over and over again.
Which is really hard to do. It's not that simple.
Sure, it's hard to look in the mirror. Truth is incredibly difficult to do.
It's like all those stories. I mean, you grew up Catholic about first confession and kids making up stuff.
I got to say something when I go in there.
And that might as well be true for the rest of your life because it's so difficult sometimes to really know yourself, to really be that self-aware and to know who you really are, to really want to understand that. And that's the goal of most therapy is that kind of self-understanding, but you have to genuinely want to get it and not to settle for some image of yourself that you would prefer to have. And that's a hard piece of spiritual work, and I'm not sure that we're all willing to do it all the time. That's
why I like reading about historical figures and people that I hold up as high examples and going, I am nowhere near the beacon of light that this person is. And that's when I look at it and say, hey, I got a long way to go or I'll never get there. Mm-hmm. But if you just sit there and don't take a look at the world and people that you look up to, I judge myself against people of like, am I living up to that level of example that I've put up there? It's my mentors. Am I anywhere close living in the shadow of those giants?
Well, and that's a good practice to know who it is that you admire, whom do you emulate, how did they proceed, and am I coming somewhere close to that?
The other thing, too, is there's a mythologization of giants, too, just the Steve Jobs story. So, the stories of Steve Jobs are not based in truth. They have been grown over the years, especially after his death. And so sometimes it's hard for a fan like myself or a disciple of these type of people in the business world of, I got to keep my perspective in mind of like, that might not be the truth, and I can't put so much pressure on myself to something that may not be unable to reach.
Well, and that's back to the issue that we talked about a moment ago about putting someone on a pedestal, and perhaps that's not fair.
It's easy putting Jesus there. He's the Son of God.
Well, he was perfect.
And that's a different way of me looking at it. Like actually, somebody told something to me this week. It was, I don't know, Johnny. What do you think you should do? I mean, you're the one that's been all the God stuff recently. Why don't you tell me? And I got so angry. I looked at the person and said, "Look, I'm trying to be like Jesus, but I am not Jesus, so I'm about to slap you in the mouth right now with that comment because I ain't there yet."
Like, what would Jesus do? I really don't know.
I know what he would do, but I ain't him right now. And I'm not turning the other cheek. I'm working on that for down the road. But it is this, you've got to keep things in perspective and just do the best you can every day. And these lessons we have are nuggets of things we try to teach every week. Take one thing from church that we work on a little bit every week. After 52 weeks, if they're 52 really positive things, That's 52 positive things you've worked on all year. That adds up.
And if you got just a few of them,
that's right, 10% of it
to work for you, then you're better than you were.
That's how I started doing Sabbadoodles. Was Matthew Kelly, Dynamic Catholic. He said, bring a journal into church. I know it's boring as heck. I get bored too. He says, but I tell you what, there's a lot of great messages throughout that whole service. Find one message, write it in your journal every week, and after 52 weeks, you have 52 incredibly smart, cool things you're working on to make your life a more positive experience.
That's good.
Of course, I went from one sentence to these ridiculous these ridiculous notes, but I mean that's what got started from it. I love how simple he made that.
Well, that's good. And I have to say, while we're in this public place, that I'm so grateful for that practice in so many ways, because we're doing this and because other good things have come of it. But we've also learned some things about it and used it in other ways. And now we've got our Sunday school kids with a book so that they can doodle in church. And they're using that then in their Christian formation class. And the thing I had to remind them, of course, being kids, is it's...
Pay attention.
You have to pay attention. It's about paying attention.
Don't draw Pokemon.
Right. And do realize that you're going to share that in class.
So you got to show your work.
Right. You have to show your work. And so you want to be careful about what you put in there. But my own daughter did say, what I asked her was, what did you think of the sermon?
Oh.
This was a couple of weeks ago. And what she said, well, church was good. She said, it goes a lot faster when you've got that doodle book. And so she was enjoying.
And that's, I look at that too. It keeps me, like I said, I do this because it keeps me in the moment. I can go back and refer to it. It really is it's fun. I've really enjoyed it. I had the nicest thing happen last week. I forgot to talk about it last week. It really teared me up at church. Mackenzie, the little girl. So we're sitting there, and it was about 3/4 through. We're about in the communion area where we're reading that part of after the piece, and we're all standing there, and Stacy nudges me on the shoulder and points down in the aisle at our seats. And it's little Mackenzie. She's maybe 3 or 4, and she's holding this little bitty card that she has drawn on in church, and it looks like a Jesus and the apostles, and she hands it to me, and I just started to cry. And Stacy goes, "That was so amazing." And then I don't look at myself as an example, but if I really like the fact if I'm impacting somebody in a positive way, again, we talk about these building this future generation in the right way, that made me feel like I've really done something without doing something, because it was just my example.
But she knew that you were not just sitting there making notes for work or
playing on my phone,
that you were actually doing something that was about our worship, and she did it too.
Yeah, and I have it right now. I'm going to take a picture of it. I'll put it on the website.
That's wonderful.
It did. It made me. I talked about that all week, because it was such a great, positive moment that it was just so innocent. It was so innocent and pure, and it was just sweet to have. And I told her mother today. I was like, it's actually his grandmother. I thought it was her mother. She's so young looking, but she was like, "Oh, thank you. You made my day." That's my granddaughter, not my daughter. But I was like, "Tell Mackenzie, thank you so much. That is just wonderful, and keep up the good work and keep drawing."
Well, and that's another example of how kids learn in church and the experience that they have in church, and I try to keep putting out in front of people, because there's an urge to, especially for the little ones, to take them out and have them go do something else. And we do that. They have their own chapel for the first half. But there's so much that they just absorb. Words and music and things like, how do people worship and what do they do? And they're so spongy when they're little like that. And they really take all that in, and it never goes away, because it's coming in at that really formative time. And it's just in there.
And that's why it's important for us to be good examples, because they are taking it in.
That's right. And it's like that little Bible verse that I sang for you before we started, and goodness knows how young I was when I learned that, but I'll never forget it. And that was part of the sermon today, actually, it's our obligation to make sure that we keep this here for these kids and their kids and their kids. That's our job. That's an expectation. It's not just for us to enjoy.
And you brought it up really well because we mentioned someone who passed away, Nick Holmes, who was an architect, and he worked on the church, and he's a historic preservation. It's his life's work, and he loved that church. But when your sermon, you were talking about this obedience to this future generation. You were saying how important this church is physically.
Right.
The physical building is an important thing because it gives us a home base. But then you said it's also the acts and the works inside of this building that is more important.
Right. It's the things that emanate from it and what people experience when they come to it. That church has been there since 1822. It's been there a very long time. And it was built by people who left it to the care of others. And the sense of responsibility for that, for me at least, is really keen. And I would hope that it's really keen for others as well. And now we've got the Mardi Gras Park that's going up right in front of us.
That whole area is changing. It's
opening
amazing.
Up and changing. And it's a time of tremendous opportunity. With that opportunity comes some real obligation.
We've gone, again, way too far.
Long.
But it's great discussion, as always. Wonderful. Thank you so much for everybody joining us. I'm Johnny Gwynn. Great conversation today. Really positive stuff. I started being I thought it was so cryptic, and the more we've worked through it, it really is a simple message once we get through it. But it's really big, complex ideas, though.
It is. It can be off-putting or intimidating on the outside.
Sure. You're asking a lot of us. We're pretty much saying you have to be a worthless slave in your own mind to be obedient to the small works of God.
Yeah. But isn't it true? Do you really want to do anything that doesn't ask a lot of you? I don't want to do anything
of any value has a massive sacrifice to it.
That if I want some expectation out there. I really want this to matter.
Challenge yourself.
If it doesn't matter, I don't want to do it.
Yeah.
If there's not really something to get into here, why bother?
Don't challenge the little ones, but challenge yourself.
Well, don't trip them.
Don't
stick your foot out and
stumble them, right?
Right. Don't be yourself around them. Just
for goodness sake,
be a better Johnny around them.
The shining beacon, not your normal selves.
That's right.
Okay, everybody, thanks so much. And we didn't even get into this wonderful, the Battle of Home, which if anybody gets a chance to look at it's called the Battle of Home. It's about the destruction of Syria and this architect and how she's working to her not fleeing Syria and committed to her hometown of Homs.
Living there with her family.
Living there, and so it's in the New York Times, right?
It was in the New York Times about 2 weeks ago.
And she's on theguardian.com. I'm reading too. It's called The Battle for Home, and she is committed to staying in that war-torn country, and she is bound and determined to rebuild back that city,
right, and make it better.
Make it better. That is the strength in that, and that's the worst of times. And her faith is so strong. She knows, I believe in something more than this, and we will get past this. And that's a lot of strength.
It is.
Yeah. And I do like the fact that Paul told Timothy, God did not make us cowards.
Right.
There ain't no coward in none of this, buddy.
He didn't give you the spirit of cowardice.
I love that.
No.
Everybody have a great week. And as usual, we are going to end on your words, Reverend Gibson.
Amen.
If you'd like to know more about Beverly Gibson and Christ Church Cathedral, please visit christchurchcathedralmobile.org. There you'll find information on the church, Reverend Beverly Gibson's recorded sermons, and sermon notes. If you want to know more about Johnny and his Sabbadoodles, visit pulpittopew.com. I would also like to thank Deep Fried Studios and producer Stacy Wellborn. Without her, this show would not get made. If you have any comments, likes, dislikes, please send information to Stacy at deepfriedstudios.com. Everyone have a great day, and thanks for listening.